In today's video, I'm going to share my favorite techniques for photographing dramatically different skin tones in the same shot. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. I'm a portrait and fashion photographer, and one of the things I'm hired to shoot all the time is in the realm of skincare. And the reason people reach out to me is because I know how to take a wide range of different skin tones and flatter them all in a single shot. This is highly in demand for things like foundation or sunscreen, you name it. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about some of the different techniques that I use to flatter so many different skin tones in a single shot. In fact, I've been hired to shoot groups of 5, 10, 20, where the whole point was that everyone had a different range of skin tone. So when we approach photographing and flattering skin, I need to consider a couple of different things. First of all, we're going to consider the direction of our light. Next, we're going to talk about the quality of light. Then the number of lights. And then last but not least, what are we trying to achieve in camera versus post-processing? So let's start at the very beginning talking about our directionality. Now the two beautiful subjects that I have here, they are on opposite ends of the foundation spectrum. And so what I want to try to do is I want to try to flatter both of them in the shot. I'm not trying to make them look similar in tone, but I don't want one person to be too overexposed or another to be too underexposed. So really what I'm thinking about here is flattering them with the directionality of light as well as my choices of modifier. So we're going to start off with the direction. Now, as might make sense to you, when I'm photographing a much lighter skin and darker skin subject, I usually want to take my light source and have it further away from the subject with lighter skin. Now the reason why is the fall off of light in inverse square law. Basically, whoever is closest to the light is going to be brightest. So it would make sense that I would probably want the light source to be a little bit closer to the person with darker skin tone. So let's start there. Now the modifier that I have on, I will eventually change, and we're going to talk about that, but I'm currently using a beauty dish. A beauty dish is a relatively soft quality of light, and it's one of my favorites for beauty photography. But for the goals of this photo, we're likely going to switch it out. All right, so let's take our very first shot. All right, so let's take a look at what's going on in this photograph. Now, if Maddie is approximately well exposed, you can see that Niley is looking much darker. Couple of things. One, that's because Maddie is closer to the light. And then also we have a lot more of Niley's face on the shadow side. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to take that main light and move it to the opposite side and take a look at the differences. All right, so let's take a look at the differences here. Now, first of all, one of the things you can absolutely see is that now Niley is much more correctly exposed. The highlights on her face are brighter, and then Maddie still seems relatively correctly exposed. But another thing I want you to notice is that more of the shadow side of Maddie's face is towards camera. But because it is lighter, those shadows don't go as dark. It doesn't go as deep. So if you look here in the original photograph, Niley's shadows go to almost black, whereas Maddie still has a bit of detail. So just by moving the light over to the left-hand side of the frame, we've improved it dramatically. So that is consideration number one. If you are going to have some sculpting to your light, if you're going to have the light off to the left or the right-hand side of the frame, be sure that it's closer to the person with the darker skin tone. But next, let's talk about our modifier choice. Now, I'm going to give a general rule of thumb, but know that there are so many different considerations in photography, right? There's stylistic considerations if you're trying to achieve a certain mood or specularity to the skin. But in general, if I'm photographing a group of people with a wide range of skin tones, I typically grab softer light modifiers. And the reason I do that is because they're not quite as specular. And they're going to be a little bit more even across everyone's skin tone. So for example, if I grab a hard light modifier, for example, this beauty dish isn't even a hard light, it's relatively soft, but let's say I grab a bare bulb. What happens is that light is very specular, so it's very, very shiny. And when you're looking at a darker skin tone, all you're going to see are just small little specular reflections on the skin, and then the shadows go really dark. And because it's such a contrasty light, well, the highlights on the lighter skin tone are also going to go overexposed. And in general, what it does, it's almost like dragging the contrast slider in post-processing. Highlights get brighter, shadows get darker, everything gets more specular and a little bit more crunchy, and it's harder to make things look even. So when I grab a larger, softer modifier, what it does is it makes the highlights a little bit smoother. In fact, when you're looking at a darker skin tone, what you're seeing on the skin, those highlights, that's the reflection of the light source. So when you choose a larger modifier, you're seeing more of that reflection. And so it just makes the skin look a little bit smoother and a little bit more even. Plus, a softer quality of light when you're trying to flatter skin, it always makes the texture look a little bit better and the shininess of the skin look a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same setup, but what we're going to do is switch to a large umbrella with diffusion. Now, this could also be, for example, a 4 or 5 foot octabox, but the idea is that it is a larger and diffused light source, which is going to make a bigger reflection on the skin, and it's going to make it just a little bit softer. Okay, so time to take a look at the differences here. Now, it is pretty subtle. But for example, I want you to take a look at the differences in the glow on Nyelite's skin. It's just a little smoother, it's a little bit brighter, it's a little bit more even because we've gone from a harder, not even a harder light source, a mid light source to something a little bit softer. So overall, you'll notice the skin tone is just a tiny bit more even. Now, I did want to draw attention to one more thing. When you are looking at lighter skin tones versus darker skin tones, you need to pay attention to both highlights and shadows. So for example, if you look at Maddie over here, you can still see the highlight on her forehead. However, it's a bright highlight against a lighter skin tone, so you don't notice it as much. Whereas darker skin tones, you do have to pay attention to that. Now, you'll also notice that over here, the shadows on the side of her face are giving her a little bit of structure. And so you have to decide, how much fill do you want? What's the purpose of the shot? In other words, if I want to make sure I have detail in all of the shadows, this is where you may need to consider some sort of fill light. Or if you purposely want it to be more dramatic, maybe next to Maddie, you would actually want negative fill. Maybe a black V-flat or something to absorb the light, to carve out her features a little bit more. So this is why I said it's not one size fits all. It does depend on your end goal of the shot. So I've so far have talked about the position of the light, your modifier choice, but let's talk about the number of lights. So when you're creating a shot like this, do you want to illuminate the subjects with just a single light and some reflectors, or do you have additional strobes available? Having a second strobe can be really useful. You can use it in a couple of ways. First and foremost, if you wanted to, you could have a large soft light source, and then next to the person with a darker skin tone, you could layer in another light just a little bit brighter. And sometimes I'll do that on campaigns, especially when it's video and I'm not doing as much post work. But typically how I'm using my second light is to control the detail of the fill, of the shadows. And so for example, if we look at our darker skin tone, you look in the shadows and it's maybe just losing a little bit of detail. If I bring in another soft light source, I can control those and just lift them up a little bit, which will make everyone have just a little bit more even illumination. Now I could do this. One of my favorite techniques for beauty photography is a stripped softbox below for fill. I could use a large umbrella for fill. Again, some softer light choices. Or I can use a light bounced off of the ceiling, off of the corner of the room. This is one of my favorite techniques because it fills in softly everywhere and you don't need to bring along another modifier. So let's bring in the fill light. Perfect, so here's what you're going to see. You'll notice that the shot overall gets a little bit brighter, but in particular, you'll notice that we have a little bit more illumination in the shadows on both of our subjects' faces, and it just lifts it up a little bit. So the question for you is going to be, is the shot meant to be more dramatic or lighter and airier? How much more detail do you want to see in the shadow areas? For example, what's nice about this is I can simply turn up the power of the light if I want more fill to the shadows. And notice there's no shadows being cast on the background and everyone is getting an even fill light because this is a giant bounce light. It's basically just the ceiling in the corner of my room, which means it's a really soft, diffused light source. Of course, this only works if you have neutral or white colored walls. Let me try it with a little bit brighter. So having gone up a stop, it's just a little bit glowier everywhere. So far I've talked about your position of light, your modifier choice if you have fill, but I want to talk about one more variation on this concept. What happens if I want the softest light possible? and I just want light wrapping around and creating smooth, even highlights everywhere. Well, the larger the modifier is, the softer the light. So I'm using a large umbrella here. I guess I could go to a large umbrella, but what could I do that would be even softer? I have two approaches. For a vast majority, I mean literally most of my beauty campaigns, I use something called a scrim. Particularly, I use the Westcott Scrim Gym, the 8x8 foot or the 12x12 foot. And a scrim is a frame with a piece of diffusion material across it, which is basically what you have in the front of a softbox. And this becomes the light source. You actually light the scrim, which means it is a huge soft wrapping light source, and it can light a group of 3, 5, 10, 20 people with completely even light. Because the large umbrella we have here is working great on the two of them, but if I started to stack layers of people, the lighting wouldn't be even. So that's when I reach for my scrim. Now this is a specialty tool, and of course not everybody has one of these available. So I'm going to make a modification to the setup you see right here. Rather than having the large umbrella be the main and the bounce light be the fill, I'm going to get rid of the umbrella. And now my fill is going to be the main light. In other words, I'm going to turn up the power, I'm going to open up my aperture, and all of this bounce light will just give a beautiful soft illumination across both of my subjects. This won't necessarily have the same sculpting of the light, but you'll definitely see a beautiful, even, flattering quality of light. Okay, so what I want you to take a look at is just how soft this quality of light is. If we pop back and take a look at the beauty dish, you see that there's a lot more texture to the skin and it's not quite as even. Whereas this bounce light source is smooth and you can barely see any texture on either of their skin. It's really, really beautiful. But that again comes down to if that was the point of the photo. Did you like the first shot where it was a little bit more glowing and a little bit more sculptural? Well, that's a stylistic choice. But if you want it to be quite even across the subjects, perhaps the bounce light is going to be a good choice. So what you can see in this photograph is that they're just beautiful, even highlights across both of their faces. And when you zoom in and you look at the texture of the skin, there's hardly any. And that's what you're getting from that big, soft light source. But of course, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Maybe you like some of the earlier shots with the beauty dish because it does have a little bit more glow and a little bit more specularity. That's also fine. Now, I've mentioned the position or direction of the light, talked about modifiers, talked about fill or the number of lights, but there's another thing that I mentioned, which was how much do you want to achieve in camera versus post-processing? Now, obviously, I try to achieve as much in camera as possible, but that doesn't mean I'm not considering little tweaks in post. So for example, in this final shot, I really like the quality of light across the face, but maybe Maddie is looking just a teeny bit overexposed. Well, right now I'm in a program called Capture One, and it has some fantastic AI masking. So I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to grab their AI brush. And basically all I did is mouse over to Maddie and it selected her skin tone. So now when I click on her, notice how I could darken the skin tone down just a little bit. Now, I'm not trying to change her skin tone. I'm trying to make it look more accurate to what it is in real life. That tiny little change, I think, made the shot. And so I now know how easy it is to mask and make tweaks, especially in programs like Capture One or Lightroom, especially using RAW and their AI selections. So sometimes, as long as I'm pretty close, I know that I can actually do just little fast changes to perfect it in post-processing. These two ladies look beautiful, and I think the light and the mood is looking great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a shot. Now, just a little bit about the tools that I'm using here. The strobes I'm using are ProPhoto Pro D3s. My camera is the Canon R5 Mark II, and I'm using my favorite, my go-to lens, the Canon RF 24-105 2.8. I'm going to try some different compositions, some different expressions, and get a beautiful shot because this is exactly what my clients are always asking me for. All right, let's get it. All right, so there you have it. My favorite tips for flattering dramatically different skin tones in a single shot. Now, how I think of it is, all right, where's the position of my light? If I'm photographing only a couple of people, I want to make sure my light source is closer to the person with the darker skin tone. If I'm flattering multiple people, perhaps a softer modifier, perhaps a bigger modifier like a large umbrella or a big softbox or even a bounced light source is going to be a better choice. Do I need a fill light to help me achieve the mood and perhaps get some detail back into the shadows? And then last but not least, do I like the shot as is? And maybe I'm gonna just do a little bit in post to help bring the skin tones a little bit closer together. So those are all the things that are going through my head, and I'm not using any one setup. It varies from shoot to shoot, from client to client, whether it is a portrait of a couple or it is a skincare campaign. Now, if you wanna see the gear used to make these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below, and of course, visit Adorama.com. I have so many more videos that go through everything from really practical considerations like photographing skin tones to much more creative lighting techniques. So be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time, guys.